Thank you, Mr. Vice President. As I was mentioning that I looked at the concerns of the leader of the oppositions, and I'm thinking with a political year ahead, we need to somehow put mechanisms in place where we would not cause any sort of major disruption in society if perchance someone on the opposition happens to be, in breach of any laws and end up being in a situation where this Interception of Communications Act may be necessary to be meted out to get certain information. So that is why I'm suggesting that the mechanisms in place really would try to allay the fears of the public that, as far as possible we have gone in to put in things into place to prevent any sort of abuse or misuse that may occur. That is not to say if there's a member of the opposition or any politician who is involved in any sort of corrupt practices and find themselves in breach of the law, I'm thinking, yes, I will support the full extent of the law to go after such individuals, because a corrupt politician to me takes away from the population the means of the monetary means, the economy, where people may have to, monies that would go into probably getting CAT scans, monies that would go into getting basic devices. So by all means, if this legislation can go after corrupt politicians, go after it. And as some legislations, Mr. Vice President, may even in different countries like China, they have the death penalty against politicians. I'm saying here we may have to consider, to curb that we may have to look at a life sentence sometimes for any sort of corrupt politician. So if be it as it may, I will support legislation like that if the Attorney General decides to bring it. So looking at this bill, Mr. Vice President, we have to remember, even in the case of the, where people may say, could there be a potential for abuse? And I said there could be. There are men in power, persons may want to maintain power. Even in the UK Malone case, we looked at where the wiretapping and surveillance occurred. And in cases like that, you found that the UK court said there was no right of privacy, that was recognized at common law. Thankfully, this case was appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, where they now actually said a breach occurred, and they actually forced the UK government to enact a statutory framework to have the Interception of Communications Act. So even UK, which we are now looking at their legislation, and the Attorney General has looked at that and other pieces of legislation, they were actually forced, their parliament was forced in the position where they did in fact had to put a legislative framework into the looking at the individuals and interception, any sort of communications. So definitely the need for this is there, because we have seen, as I put it, failure of the state to execute certain things in prison to protect society. So there's a need for this legislation, because you see, we have to understand there's a gap. There's still a failure in implementing safety measures for our prison officers and for others out there and witnesses. So there's still a gap. And you see, the fact that people can call hits, this to me would certainly somehow add as a plan B. So plan A is really to have a fully operationalized prison system, prison officers in force, looking at what goes in and out. Plan B, if there's a failure, we may be able to use this piece of legislation to see if we could at least prevent any sort of breaches. So definitely, the benefits is there in the Proceeds of Crime Act, the Extradition Act, the Civil Asset Recovery, Anti-Terrorism, Unexplained Wealth Act. And definitely, if we are able to intercept communications in a manner that may be very fair, a manner that persons will have less chance to point accusatory fingers at, I think we could come a long way with this. You see, but sometimes I say we have to appreciate the fact that mischief can still occur, because if you find as certain members stated that there are criminal lawyers and lawyer criminals, and there are cases where criminal lawyers. And, well, yes, but remember, those statements were made by persons who hold in high offices. So what I'm saying is, a breach can still occur where, in your conversation with your attorney or your conversation with your relatives, you can still carry out information outside, and you can still, somehow get that information outside, who you're going to put a hit on, what you're going to do, how you're going to run your business. So there are still avenues there. So I'm thinking that even though we are attempting by legislation, there would still be gaps, there will still be a continuation, because the criminal mind is such that they will be innovative and they will be able to try and see other means and ways around it. So if I'm going to a prison and I know that the phones are tapped, I wouldn't use it. Because it's a duty, according to the legislation, it's a duty for the Commissioner of Prisons to warn the prisoners that you are being monitored, or you will be monitored. So if I know I'm being monitored, I will just try to get another means. So I'm not thinking that this piece of legislation would prevent in a big way, but what I'm saying, it could be utilized, I'm saying, to get, if you have an information and you want to backtrack on those people's conversation, it could be used and it could also be misused, as certain members say. So therefore, my problem here is the accountability issue, right? We have to, I think clause 24 actually brought to the fact that, there is a report that is supposed to be laid in Parliament by the Ministry of National Security, and I think Senator Sipasad mentioned to that report, and the fact that it was delayed. I think the last report came in 2016, where the National Security Minister is supposed to lay in Parliament the interpretation of the Communications Act. And if those reports are not made, you find that, we may have to wonder, you're coming here asking us to give up some of the rights of these individuals, the freedom, the privacy issues, but little things in terms of accountability, I think the state should at least, come on board, give us those reports. Because you're asking us for one thing, but where you are supposed to be showing us that there's accountability, there was a gap. And I think the Minister of National Security did mention to the fact that it was late, and he would, in fact, try his best to bring it. And I'm thinking this is a level of accountability we have to ensure as a parliament is not lapsed, because it really is important, as it goes against, I say, the principle where you are, going against the privacy issue and against certain aspects of our Constitution. I also wondered Mr. Vice President, that if you're looking at the infringement of rights, complaints, and concerns, somehow I would have loved the Inspector of Prisons to be on board with this, because the Inspector of Prisons would have been someone who would look and hear concerns from the prisoners, the prison officers, and look to see if there's any breach in any sort of their rights. And I'm thinking, somewhere along the way, he should be factored in, whereby, he could ensure that proper procedures are followed, ensure that the prisoners are informed of their rights. And I think, out of respect for his office, I think he should be factored in somewhere into this piece of legislation. I would like now to mention that, as I had mentioned before, when we took that break, that I was a bit concerned about the areas where we may be able to intercept the communications, and I just needed some clarification. Would hospitals be also, that house prisoners, be also be factored in? As I'm mentioning, in St. Anne's Hospital, we have a forensic ward where the courts will send prisoners to us who they may be deemed, mentally ill, to get an assessment. Some of those chaps may come in there. They may not be mentally ill. They may be pretending. And if they are using phones, I'm thinking the forensic wards, I'm thinking Port of Spain Hospital, if there's a prisoner house there for some injury, somehow we have to extend that interception that could occur there. So that has to be something that should be factored in. So I would like to say that the safeguards that was put in, and I'm thinking, I am a bit, I was concerned about the safeguards, but what I'm looking at, the fact that if you are going after the private information and you have exhausted all forms of getting that information, thinking the safeguard with the judge, as I mentioned before, I would have liked that extended. And as I close, Madam Vice President, I'd like to say that, Mr. Vice President, sorry, I would like to say that, we have to be careful that we don't erode the rights of the individuals. We have to be very, very careful of that. We have to ensure that we put things in place where it doesn't cause a political turmoil in the country as far as possible. Legislation that could say, well, we went a little further, we did some greater checks and balances, so if people may feel aggrieved, we have put something in place to prevent this commerce. You see, politicians on either side may always say the other side did it, this side did it. We have a host of information. Whoever is in power or in opposition, they will accuse one another. But it's the population at large who will take the words of their leaders and may feel that sense of, aggression and disappointment. And those are the persons who I'm thinking that we need to put legislation in place that as far as possible they can say that we have tried and we have attempted to put legislation where people would have a less chance of pointing fingers and saying there's political interference or political mischief occurred. And I would like to end by quoting Lord Brown Wilkinson, where he observed, "The dossier of private information is the badge of the totalitarian state." So I'm thinking, yes, we are treading in certain grounds where we are hoping we can get at the private information of certain individuals to help the state, to help our country. And I'm saying I will support a lot of pieces of legislation that would actually give us a safer Trinidad and Tobago. I will support legislation that the Attorney General and the Ministry of National Security will come on board and say, hey, this is a piece of legislation that will make the place safer for myself and my family. I will support those pieces. But again, we also have to know that there are men in power, and we have to put legislation in place where no sort of abuse or potential abuse can occur. Thank you.
Senator Young.
Mr. Vice President, I want to thank you for the opportunity to contribute on this bill this evening, and my contribution, I assure you, will be very short. Only to put into perspective some of the things that have been said, but more importantly, the feeling and temperament of the country as a whole. So, Vice President, quite often when we sit here, because the chairs are so comfortable and the place is so nice, we can get lost into the banter of the law and the legalese and the jargon and what is OTUs and what is this, and sometimes the legal speech evades me. However, I believe that when we sit here, both sides, all sides, we sit here to try to create a better Trinidad and Tobago. We may disagree with how it ought to be done, when it ought to be done. We may have differences in, parts of the law, but generally, we are here to make the thing better, place better. And there are times and particular things that I feel strongly about. I think that when we sit here, it is just as bad to be a government of tyrants as it is to be an impotent government, as it is to be a parliament that has no real effect on the community. Because the fact remains is that most of the country, I think because the parliament does such a good job and the parliament channel is very popular these days, most of the country believes that what happens in parliament is above their heads and doesn't really affect them. But in reading this law, looking at the bill, and looking at the country, I think this is one of the times that we can say to people, like Miss Asha Budram, who lost her husband last year, I want to say to Ms. Budram, we are a year too late, but we take into consideration your case. You see, in the Guardian of August 2019, the article came out about a young man on his way to have a night out with the boys, was gunned down. He was a prison officer, Officer Budram. And at that point in time, he was the third one for the month, and about 19 within the decade. And it is usually expressed that the law doesn't really make a difference and really nothing will change because all of it is the same and the parliamentarians don't know what is going on. But in this case, and it's not only about, I want to disagree with some of the positions that, well, jammers and that kind of thing will work. We need more because the criminals don't have any boundaries. While the police have to do it by this and they can't follow the law and they can't do this, the criminals have no boundaries. I wonder if most of the colleagues in here understand that the second highest currency in the prison is phone card. The first is cigarette. Ask anybody. I have received calls from inside the prison's wall asking me to send 100 or 200 phone card. How you feel the pain for the hit? How you feel the pain for the hit? But if you follow the money and if you stop the money, you stop the crime. So the money inside is a little bit different to the money outside. And Mr. Vice President, the things that I say, I try to be as real as possible in this place. Because some of us, when we drive off in the nice vehicles and we go home, and we have the security, we can joke and laugh and fun. But to somebody else, this is serious business. Because what is joke for crapple? What is joke for children is death for crapple. So I'm serious while I'm on my legs. And I'm saying that this situation, this bill that is before us, has the express ability to save some lives. And I heard, the Honorable Senator talk about just turn on the jammers. That's not good enough. They're passing in the vehicles outside and a man sending a call and who dropping. You heard about drones and that kind of thing. Jammers won't work by itself. We require more. I don't know if I could be protected and be able to contribute. I'll sit until this time.
Continue, Senator.
Because the fact remains that without making this a political thing, Miss Asha Budram today is without a husband because somebody made a call from inside a prison and somebody paid for that, either with phone card, cigarette, something, some means. But if we follow the money in the prison, this has a serious effect outside. A serious effect. You wonder how they're buying the cell phones, a phone card. You wonder how they're doing this, and it's more liquid than cigarette because you don't have to transmit it, it takes nothing. The same way you can credit somebody's phone, you credit their phone inside the prison. More importantly, is that this legislation is not a silo, it's not a standalone legislation. I can say as a member of this House and as a citizen, this comes on the heels of a number of legislation. We've had plea bargaining that we've seen the results of in the courts. I mean, to the detriment of some of our former colleagues, but we've seen it works. We have anti-terrorism, bail restriction, firearm act, sex offenders registration, all of these registrations, all of these legislations, with the combination of having interception and brings us into maybe the 20th century. I don't even know if it's the 21st. Because we are behind time. And for the people that while we sit here and we play and we understand that you're going to trample on some, you're going to have to trample on some rights. We understand that. But the fact remains is that according to my scriptures, Romans chapter 13 I think it is, we that bear the sword, the ministers, the people who sit here, we bear not the sword in vain, but we are to be a terror to those that do evil and we have to be good to those that do good. So we ought not to be afraid. We do so with measure. There are senior counsels and other people amongst us that will make sure we're not going too far. But something has to be done. We cannot all stand around the pot and wonder how to pick it up. Somebody has to get their hands burnt, and we have to get it done. If for nobody else, for Ms. Boudram, and also Ms. Walters, who was shot dead because of her husband being a prison officer, 2 days after. And we have a nice funeral. Prime Minister at the time attended. It's nice. And after that, the heartache and pain is with Ms. Boudram up to today, while we joke him. But the fact remains is that this is a very serious legislation. I not only support this, I thank God for it and for the intervention now. Because if one of my sons decides to be a prison officer, I wouldn't want to have to look over my shoulder to wonder what will happen to him. So, I want to thank you for the opportunity, and I want to thank this House for being sober in this decision making.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I want to thank my colleague on the government benches for saying one thing that stood out to me very poignantly. Because Senator Ndale said something has to be done. And I want to encourage the government that at this stage, they are a government that has run out of time. And what has to be done is to call the elections now. Because Senator Young also said, Mr. Vice President, that we have to trample some rights. But this is not a trivial matter. The freedom and liberty of persons in this republic is by no means a trivial matter. The rights of that are being trampled by this bill in Clause 6, Clause 4, retroactivity, Clause 7, professional privilege. I mean, the clauses of this bill are far-reaching. Senator Sturge went at pains to illustrate, my apologies, to illustrate exactly where the rights being trampled would be deleterious to the system of justice that we adhere to in this country. Now, the principle of fairness. So I want to show how saying some rights need to be trampled is an insufficient analysis of the negative impact of this legislation. Because the principle of fairness, Mr. Vice President, when one considers the full illustration rendered by Senator Sturge regarding the impact of the retroactive nature of the clauses of this bill, the Interception of Communications Amendment 2020, and in particular one new offense, tipping off, which seeks to make it an offense to disclose information or any other matter which is likely to prejudice any investigation which may be connected or related to an interception. Where such an offense, in the way it is described in this legislation, was not before an offense considered in a similar manner, you have a situation where persons, Mr. Vice President, could be caught. The reality is, when you go in a retroactive manner, just one example, when you go in a retroactive manner, there are things that you may not conceive, and therefore it will give rise to many suspicions. Because trade unionists may wonder whether or not this is the Watson-Duke bill, whether or not this is the David Abdullah bill, whether or not this is the bill that is targeting leaders of the Nurses Association or any other trade union or workers association that we have defending workers' rights in this country. Now, and of course, when the government, running out of time, facing a general election in a few short months, seeking to bring such a very dangerous piece of legislation to the House, it begs the question whether or not this is politically motivated for political persecution. Now, again, we in this country understand that the rights of the people of Trinidad and Tobago is no trivial matter. When you turn to Clause 6 of the bill, it speaks to authorized officers, and Senator Sturge spoke at length on that. So I will leave that particular matter there, only to say that one cannot fault Senator Young for thinking that some rights need to be trampled, especially when one reads Clause 6. Because one will think, well, okay, Senator Young reading it would feel, well, this is a simple matter that only requires a police officer of the lowest rank. And if it's a matter that requires the intervention of a police officer of the lowest rank, then it clearly cannot be a significant issue. Therefore, the rights that are so trampled clearly aren't that big of a deal. So one cannot fault Senator Young, who, by his own admission, declared that the legalese may evade him, to think, despite having caucused on this bill on his side, that is not a big deal, you know? Because the government, through this bill, Mr. Vice President, places significant powers at the hands of officers who before would never have seen those powers at their disposal. Therefore, again, this is a serious legislation and there are significant errors in it. Now, the jammers and the policy of the government to stop the jammers, and then the statements uttered by the Minister of National Security, the actions of the Minister of National Security on Facebook, where the Minister of National Security, Mr. Vice President, was found to have, after seeing a Facebook commenter by the name that I won't give, but it's the name of an intoxicating beverage. So he went by that alias, that commenter. That's his alias. Yeah. And the Minister of National Security proceeded to disclose that person's government name, as we say in Trinidad and Tobago, his real name, his place of work, his contact details, his residence, the addresses of his residence and his place of work for the entire world to see on Facebook. Yeah. Now, we are very intelligent in this country. And it doesn't take anyone with much education to understand that it is obvious that the Minister of National Security used the resources at his disposal as minister to pursue a personal issue with someone on Facebook. And then, in an act of the highest level of irresponsibility, recklessness, and abuse of power, disclose this information on Facebook, Mr. Vice President. I saw the post and the running commentary myself. Now are we saying that this Minister of National Security that has done such a reckless act will be the person that we want to give the powers
46-6
under this legislation to, Mr. Vice President?
Senator, the line that you're going down, where you are attributing certain things to a member of Parliament, is bordering upon that Standing Order 46-6. So I would ask you to be very cautious as you're moving forward and do not impute improper motives on the members. Continue.
I thank you, Mr. Vice President. Now, what is the lesson for us in this society? To whom great power comes, we know the old adage goes, there is much responsibility that comes along with that power. Okay? And I want to say that it is reprehensible in the least for us as a parliament to bestow this type of power on such a person. I want to refer to matters that have been in the public domain. As of yesterday, Express newspapers reported, Mr. Vice President, the results of that Joint Select Committee that the Minister of National Security appeared before. It was all over a very popular radio station that I find myself listening to. I'm not sure if, anyway. So I'm sure thousands of citizens have heard the program. It was on Power 102, and the program aired from 3 to 5 p.m., and the person on the program was reading verbatim from the Express newspaper article. And what they were doing, they were juxtaposing statements of the minister about getting reports from police officers, private and confidential reports, through specific channels, and then contradicting statements of the Commissioner of Police, who's saying that no such thing is authorized to happen in the first place. So, Mr. Vice President, are we saying that this individual, who is the Minister of National Security, doing this thing that is contradictory to what the Commissioner of Police is saying should happen by law and proper process, that we want to bestow upon this individual these powers? Now, what are the powers that we are speaking of? When you look at this bill, you see the Strategic Services Agency, the SSA referenced specifically. You have the Commissioner of Police, you have the Head of Defense, and you have the Head of the SSA. And that has to do with being an authorized officer, all right, in the interpretation section. So, you have an authorized officer, Mr. Vice President, who is appointed and whose remit has to do with a specific relationship with a Minister of National Security. The SSA head and the organization interrelates with the line minister via the executive, of course. But the line minister is very important and instrumental in the relationship between the executive and the SSA. And the SSA has significant powers under this law. Now, the only recommendation that one could give the government for this is to take it, put it in a nice bow, and discard it immediately. That is the only amendment that is of value to this piece of legislation. Now, but if we wish to continue the debate to see where we shall arrive at, let's look at what exactly is trampled upon. We have privacy rights, which was spoken about at length. But what about family rights, Mr. Vice President? What about family rights? In the marriage bill that was debated when I was not a member of this place, the issue of the rights of the family to determine their destiny and the decisions that their children take was contemplated. It was taken account for, even though the age of marriage was maintained at 18, was raised to 18. It was taken into account because it would have been taken into account before, when the marriage age would have been set at a lower level. So what about the rights of the family? Because, Mr. Vice President, I would not want, and I'm sure the 1.35 million citizens of this country will not want their private family communication, which would have nothing to do with crime and criminality, which would have nothing to do with fraud, to be ventilated publicly. Now, I want to illustrate how this can be important to citizens, even though it may seem a trivial matter, by way of an example. Many persons accuse, whether it may be totally false or not, accuse some law enforcement officials of taking advantage of their home situation when they visit them, when there's a complaint by one spouse on the other. All right? Now, can you imagine if some persons now have their entire familial conversations at the disposal of officers somewhere, being shared, and then in the process of investigation, this information is disclosed to either spouse? Well, it doesn't take much of an imagination, Mr. Vice President, for you to arrive at the possible conclusion that that type of communication could lead to marriages being dissolved, broken up, dismembered, because the communication that was done in private becomes shared with their spouse or partner. That may seem a trivial matter to many, except if it happens to them. Again, what about the rights of the family? Then you go on to freedom of expression. Now, many times persons say things, so I'm just showing Senator Ndale Young, where in my mind, simple rights that should be trampled are not a small thing. It's a big thing. These are real issues that will affect people. Freedom of expression. In this country, we may say things which we may wish on our lives to remain private. It may not necessarily be statements that you may wish to act on, but it may have just been things that you are thinking about in private conversation with someone. Should that private conversation be available now to the powers that be, it could be taken entirely out of context. And then, because it is in front of them, in the way that this law presents itself, it may require the authorities to even conduct an investigation. Now, the point I'm arriving at is the way in which this law prescribes a catch-all. It spreads too wide a net. It bestows too many powers on persons who are under the control of the executive via the SSA, under the control or at least influence or relationship to a minister who, by the two examples I showed at the beginning of this debate, can be accused of being reckless in administering his duties. And then, of course, we move to freedom of the press. Now, I was listening for ways in which the media may have significant issues with this piece of legislation. And I want to point out a couple that I find should have been focused on a little more. One has to do not just with the sources of information to the media, but what happens with that information when it returns in-house. Because the conversation seems to be focused only on the journalist who gets information from a source, whether it be from an underworld source or a source in the prison, all right? Based on the clause that speaks to communicating persons behind prison walls, all right? But what happens when that journalist who gets this information, as Senator Richards mentioned, that persons may have tried to communicate with journalists in the past and continue to do so from behind prison walls, what happens when that journalist decides to not ignore but actually act on the information and prepare a brief and get that brief approved and passed by their editors, their sub-editors? Are these people also going to be culpable, Mr. Vice President? That's a question that I would want to answer. Because then it's not just that eager journalist who's trying to write a good story, who's trying to shed light on the truth. It may implicate the entire media house by extension. The question is, where do we draw the line? And how do we cater for the fourth estate, as we call the media? Now, Mr. Vice President, I think there's lessons to be learned from history. There are lessons to be learned from history, and I want to point to an example that is very relevant, given that on Ash Wednesday, we mark the 50th anniversary of the commencement of the revolution of the people of Trinidad and Tobago of 1970, which also is known as the Black Power movement, Black Power Revolution. Because, Mr. Vice President, you'd be very surprised to know, not you, of course, because you are well read, but persons in this country would be very surprised to know that if you were caught from 1970 to 1974 with a book written by, researched by, and published by the Prime Minister, the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams, you would have been charged for sedition and arrested and imprisoned. Now, there are other books and articles and stuff that you would have been charged with. And I want to crave your indulgence to read a short excerpt from an article. All right? I'm trying to find the name of the journal. I'll ask to provide the name of the magazine afterward. But it was published. This is from 1974. And the article starts, "Crackdown starts on subversive literature." One person, Kirkland Paul of Saon, has been charged with possession of subversive literature following a police raid on his home on September 1st. In a recent search on the home of Dr. Michael Camps, police asked about copies of Tapia found in his house. I believe this was from the Tapia newspaper. All right, I can't remember the exact year. It is therefore clear that what is actually subversive literature is left to the discretion of the authorities, who in fact can arbitrarily declare any publication subversive, or an individual in suit of any publication, for example, the copy of Tapia you are reading now. For instance, Kirkland Paul was charged with possession of several books, including Conventional Politics or Revolution, published by the National Joint Action Committee, and Revolution in the Revolution by Regis Debray, which sells at several bookstores around the country. And Modern Politics, a compilation of a series of lectures delivered at the Public Library by C.L.R. James while a member, hear this, of the People's National Movement. During the 1970 state of emergency, a UWI student spent 4 days in jail, received an unasked haircut, unasked, so unsolicited haircut then, and they cut, I can't see the other part, because he was picked up in a roadblock with a book entitled The Sugar Revolution. Now, 50 years ago, Mr. Vice President, the police officers would have had to find you with the books on you, or have someone put the books on you, but they had to find the books on you. So you could have been imprisoned for having in your possession speeches read at a PNM convention by C.L.R. James. You understand, Mr. Vice President? How dangerous the law is. The law sometimes does not mean justice. So just as you could have been charged and imprisoned, locked up, for having speeches delivered at a PNM convention in 1970 while PNM was in power, if you are in possession of articles, because the sedition law has not yet been struck down, articles that could be considered seditious, at least in the mind of the state, on your phone, via email or anything, then, Mr. Vice President, that could cause the state to charge you with sedition. So many citizens in this country could be doing as Kirtland Paul in Samoa would have done in 1970, being charged with sedition. And I wanted to list the subversive periodicals. This is from the TNT Gazette. I have the source too. TNT Gazette, volume 6, number 91 of the 20th September.
As much as you've made your point and attempted a connection to the bill that is before us, to go deeper into what you're trying to explain brings you outside relevance. Point has been made, but I ask you to move forward now.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you. So, the point is, persons are saying, oh, it's simple. These are innocuous clauses that can help protect people in this country. But what we are not examining is, one, the fact that the clauses are dangerous, and two, we have a history of state-sponsored violence against our citizens in this country called Trinidad and Tobago. And we must not be part of continuation of an oppressive regime against the very citizens that put us here in this country. At least you don't expect us on this side to be part of that, to help a government who is out of time with a few months left before election. What is the purpose of this bill? It is dangerous. The retroactive aspect, I said, is dangerous. It will shut down journalists. It will make journalists so fearful of being caught that it will prevent them from doing their job. Now, what are the mitigants that they could have utilized? We are hearing none of that. Destruction of evidence. Clause 19 harkens back to email gate. Now, under the changes being envisaged by this bill, they could keep your information as long as they feel that they may be able to use it to build a case against you. Everything is admissible. Everything is possible. Everything can become that thing that the states use against you. So basically, the odds are stacked against you, even with a simple procedural thing such as destruction of evidence. Now, Mr. Vice President, I want to close on this point. And I want to totally stand opposed to the statements made by Senator Young prior. that it's not a simple matter of some rights being trampled on. It is the rights of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago that are being discarded and trampled upon by this very legislation. I want to submit that this government has proven itself to be bankrupt of ideas. This Minister of National Security, who will be the person to execute the things under this bill via the SSA in particular and via the police indirectly, has proven to be reckless. And we will not support this government in this bill. We will not support this government in the changes they wish to make, and we definitely will not support this Minister of National Security. The time has come, they have run out of time, and I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Chote.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to speak on this proposed piece of legislation. Now, I agree with Senator Obika that this is not an easy piece of legislation to digest, but I think we have, up till this point, heard enough about the man in prison calling shots, and we've heard enough about political targeting and that kind of thing. And perhaps at this stage of the debate, what we can do is try to pull back a little bit, look at the legislation, and consider whether it is a quality piece of legislation which will enhance the security of citizens of the country as a whole. Now, I begin by saying that we must appreciate that an act such as this, in a way, protects us. The reason for that is any government in power, whether this one or any other, can and probably already may have equipment to monitor people's data and conversations and communications. And I don't know, maybe there are people who do monitor. When you have legislation, though, which says that if you have to intercept and monitor, you have to fall within the ambit of an act, then the citizens are protected by legislation of this kind. Now, I do not say, however, I do not take the point further to say that I necessarily find that this piece of legislation as drafted accomplishes the kind of protections for the citizens that I think we ought to see in this kind of legislation. So let us first put it in context. It is better to have a regulatory law for this kind of investigatory process than not to have any law at all. Now, in my research for this presentation, I came across a report which was organized by CARICOM in conjunction with the European Commission. It took place in the meeting or the workshop or whatever it was, took place in 2010, and CARICOM countries were all represented, including the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. A report was prepared, and it's actually published on the internet, and it's dated 2013. It's called Harmonization of ICT Policies, Legislation and Regulatory Procedures in the Caribbean. Now, I suspect this was kind of an answer to what people refer to as the Five Eyes Alliance amongst the 5 big countries, which basically have agreements to monitor security issues: the US, Canada, the UK, Australia. Can't remember what the 5th one is. So CARICOM got together and decided that we are all going to implement, as far back as 2010, CARICOM had decided that we are going to implement legislation to regulate the interception of this kind of data. And it's very useful because it provides precedents as to what the legislation should contain, what kinds of protections should be included, and it gives you the reasons for all of these things. So it makes good reading and was very helpful to me in my preparation for this debate. Now, I am not going to look at this piece of legislation section by section. I just have a few comments that I wish to make with respect to certain aspects of it. I feel that the legislation gives too much power to 3 public officials to make an application for the interception of communication. And there are other agencies with investigatory powers who may very well benefit from having such power given to them and permitting independent investigations to take place. I use as an example the director of the Police Complaints Authority. When our murder rate contains a significant number of killings which fall under the rubric of police killings, then it means that the director of police complaints ought to have as part of his arsenal to investigate such crimes if they are crimes, because if you kill someone, whether you're a police officer or not, if you murder someone, whether you're a police officer or not, you need to be held to account for it. So the director of police complaints, I think, is one such person. His powers would be enhanced by that. He should be included in authorized officer to permit him to go to a judge and make an application for access to this kind of information from service providers. Another person, another independent office holder, I think would be important, and this would be useful, especially since there is the fear that this information might be used for political purposes and so on. But the Director of Public Prosecutions certainly should be included as one of the authorized officers. At first, I didn't quite understand why the Chief of Defense Staff was there. But then I appreciated that with national security issues, such a person must possibly be one of the applicants. I can't understand, though, why both the Commissioner of Police and the head of the SSA must be authorized persons. Because presumably, if the SSA wishes to make such an application, the SSA would go to the Commissioner of Police. That's how I understand it. Perhaps I'm wrong. So I'm just thinking that perhaps we could give a little, or focus a little bit more on that. With respect to what happens when an application is made for, I can't remember if the word uses warrant or an order of the court, I think we must be careful in the legislation to ensure that what happens there before the judge should, as far as possible, remain confidential until such time that a judge decides that it should not, or parts of it should not. So what I suggest, and again, all of these ideas are not new, I must say they are largely borrowed from that report which I looked at. What we can consider including respectfully is that when someone goes to make an application for such an order, that there be some sort of record kept. Date, time. You don't want to have the persons involved in the application necessarily named, because then, depending on the nature of the offense, you may put their lives at risk and so on. But certainly, you caught here with a difficult problem. Because if for some reason that information comes out, if these people are not named, how do we know where the security breach came from? So what I'm respectfully suggesting is that there should be more focus on setting out the process of what occurs before the judge during the course of the application, and that after this consideration is given to the application, that the documents be sealed and kept in the custody of the Registrar of the Supreme Court. It should be made an offense for anyone to break that seal without the authorization of a judge of the Supreme Court, with the attendant penalty. I move on very quickly. I see that the legislation attempts to protect someone from being made to talk, being induced or tricked and so on, entrapped, in other words, to have a conversation which may breach his privilege against self-incrimination. But I think perhaps if entrapment is what we're looking at, then perhaps we should include the words promise and coerce to induce and trick. Now, why I say this piece of legislation is difficult is because we are saying that essentially you can go to a judge and you can make an application for material to be collected over a period of time. If you are looking at an offense which attracts a penalty of over 10 years. Now, unfortunately, because some of our laws have not yet been amended, for example, the Sexual Offences Act, is it that there is a possibility that I don't know, how should I put it? Same-sex conversations happening between two people may be collected and may be used for purposes such as blackmail and that kind of thing. I think that is the weakness in the legislation that we need to consider and plug the hole. If we see it, let's try to plug the hole instead of waiting for it to happen and then everyone becoming aghast that it has happened. The thought came to my mind, actually, when Senator Obika was talking about private life, and I was thinking that this was one of the things we may look at. Now, Section 17 in particular is a big section and quite significant. And it talks about the special measures which may be taken, and it talks about, I believe, the special advocate representing the person in terms of the admissibility of evidence. I was thinking that this perhaps should be the exception rather than the rule. Because if you have someone who's appointed a special advocate by the court, essentially you're acting, I would assume, amicus. So you would be there to assist the court on the law. Your problem is someone who is acting amicus often has the full factual context of the case in which he's assisting the court. And I am not quite sure, in the absence of rules and regulations, I'm not quite sure how this is going to operate for a special advocate to make submissions or to take arguments on the question of admissibility without having a full factual background. A special advocate acting in those circumstances may very well run the risk of being possibly in breach of the Legal Profession Act. I haven't looked at that aspect of it closely enough. But certainly, if you are making a legal submission and it is going to affect the due process rights or the fair trial of someone charged with a criminal offense, then the special advocate certainly might have good reason to get cold feet when called upon by the judge to assist in such a case. Disclosure. Now, at some point, as we saw in the Dudus case in Jamaica, at some point, when you have this kind of collection of evidence, of electronic evidence, the material and how it came about and so on may become significant in the course of a criminal trial. And in that case, what the judge ordered, I think what had happened is the criminal judge had said, no, you're not entitled to get anything. And then a constitutional motion may have been filed. I can't recall the nature of the motion. But the decision was that part of his fair trial entitlement was to have some of the material used in the investigation accessible to him. So he got some information, and it was redacted material so that people's identities were protected and so on. But it means that disclosure is going to be one of the issues which must be considered when we look at this act. And I say, perhaps if we had more rules and regulations, or if we already had the rules and regulations, I may not be making the comments that I am. I read another interesting article, thankfully introduced to the website by the senator who sits to my left, Senator Vera. It's the Lexology website. And there was a publication on the 10th of February 2020 called The Future of International Crime. And essentially what the article was saying is that when we have legislation, or when we create legislation to intercept communication, we have to keep abreast of how communication is evolving. I did not know, but apparently we have 5G facilities here. And for some reason, it seems as though it's more difficult to monitor 5G metadata. I don't know if I'm using the right terminology. And this has caused a problem for law enforcement in other territories. So one of the things the article was saying is that when you legislate, make sure you keep in mind that this is an evolving world in terms of the creation of methods of communication. But I was thinking of a platform that my daughter often uses. And it's this one where you type in something and it disappears. Snapchat. So do we have the facilities to have to have that? I'm quite happy to hear Senator Richards tell me that we can get it back. I'll keep that in mind. In addition, so I don't know if those things are capable of being monitored. In addition to which, artificial intelligence, for example, can one Alexa speak to another Alexa? Yes. Can communication be done by that? Can criminality be conveyed through those methods? And do we have the facilities, or do our providers have the facilities to give us that kind of information? That kind of device-to-device communication. Now, what I strongly recommend, because it actually happened in a case that I was doing, and it wasn't a case where conversations and texts and so on had been recorded. It was a simple fact of trying to place someone at a certain time in a particular vicinity. Process of triangulation, I think they call it. And the service providers came and gave their evidence and so on. But what became apparent in all of this is that really it is not as precise as you would like it to be. It all depends to some extent on the number of towers, for example, you have in the area. If you just have one tower, well, then you stand a better chance of getting an accurate idea of where in the triangle the person was. But if you have several towers, that information might be mixed up and unclear. Now, if we are having this legislation created, we need to know that the information we are going to get from these service providers is quality information. I think we also have to put in something to say that it must be given in a timely fashion, because that also has been my experience. Because sometimes the order of the court is to the company, the order is served on the company, and the head of IT takes it, or some other person, and then it passes around as a piece of paper, and there's no compliance, and the investigating officer is running around in circles trying to get information, which is aging as he goes along. So we ought to include in the legislation a time frame for compliance. And if the agency cannot comply within a time frame, they must provide the judge or the applicant with a reason for not being able to comply, because they are carrying out a very important function. They must also take the responsibility of ensuring that their equipment is up to standard, so that what they produce to investigating officers is material that can be used in a court of law. Because we would just be wasting our time if we've stood here for 2 days and debated this piece of legislation, and then cases are falling down in court because of the quality of the material or the product provided by service providers. So I don't know, maybe perhaps the TATT can do an audit every year to ensure that these companies are up to standard in terms of equipment and their ability to do what they are required to do. Now, Section 22, let me see if I have it right. Oh yes, it's Part 3 under General Provisions. It says that the minister shall be informed of an interception under Section 62B. See what 62B says so that I can make sense. Six. Yes, where it's without a warrant, within 96 hours of the commencement of the interception. I couldn't understand what is the reason for the minister getting involved in the process. Because as far as I'm concerned, especially if we are broadening the scope of the persons who can apply, if we are broadening the scope to include people like the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Director of Police Complaints, of the Police Complaints Authority, then certainly we wouldn't want it to have a minister involved. I think the minister would become involved if the application is made by the Chief of Defense Staff, or we could qualify it by saying where it is in relation to a national security issue. That will take away any suspicion of use of the material for political purposes. And I think perhaps that was the intention, is just that maybe the language was a bit broader than intended. So Madam President, these are my respectful comments with respect to this piece of legislation. I think it's a good piece of legislation. I can see the need for it, but I think there is some work to be done on it to tighten it up, and I hope that we are able to accomplish that. Thank you very much.
Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And let me thank my colleague, Senator Chote, for her distillation of certain parts of the bill and for her tone and for her approach to this piece of legislation that is obviously needed. Madam President, over the Carnival period, some colleagues of mine in Port of Spain were very distressed as they related to me the morning after the all-inclusive fete at CIC, also known as St. Mary's College. Quite a few people ended up at the police station, brutalized and carried down, and I understand it was about 50 or 60 persons. Now, there might be persons who say the police were wrong to do that. But what better place to brutalize than outside an all-inclusive fete?
Yeah.
Because I always wondered how all those cars that are parked outside the fete get home. Somebody has to be breaking the law. And what better way to find out who is breaking the law than implementing the law outside the fete? Something like that doesn't distress me at all. Many years ago, my niece, as soon as she turned 18 and found her way in UE, introduced me to the rum shuttle, a 12-seater that the students paid for, and they got themselves to and from the fete. And I say that to say, what better place to use legislation like this than the prison and the prison vehicle? Because what would the prisoners be talking about? They'd be talking about crime. If you've read at least one of the John Grisham novels, I've read all of them, he writes a lot about this and the issue of somebody in jail called a jail snitch, somebody being planted. All of these things have been tested in the law and are found with certain safeguards to be absolutely necessary. And these are the times that we live in. These are the things that are appropriate. And it is in that context I welcome Senator Chote's contribution, as I welcome the contributions of my colleagues on the independent bench. The fact is that this is not simple legislation. Any piece of legislation that interferes in the manner that this bill seeks to do is not simple. It creates a lot of liability and a lot of risk. In fact, it asks of us to put legislative cover to what would normally be criminal conduct. And whether you believe that privacy is a constitutional right, it interferes with privacy. And this bill touches on still emerging risks in the law. I made a note when I was reading the bill for the first time. I made a note on Jeff Bezos. And if you have not understood the power of somebody who wants to invade, well, ask Bezos. With all his wealth and knowledge of technology and so on, he could not protect himself. So on the one hand, we have those who want to interfere, including us, and on the other hand, we have those who need to be protected, including us. And part of what Senator Chote has spoken about is striking the appropriate balance. And part of that balance is found in Clause 7, and I'll get to that, striking the balance, because in Clause 7, we get to this thing called legal professional privilege. And when I was taught legal professional privilege at university, it was almost something that was absolute. It was unthinkable that the law will knock on your door, or the door of an attorney, or get a warrant to search the files of attorneys, or search the person of an attorney, search the phone of an attorney. But legal professional privilege has been whittled down in a way that it exists in the minority now. It is not something, I learned early in law school the concept of a cloistered virtue. Legal professional privilege is not a cloistered virtue anymore. But this bill still strikes something of a balance by protecting some element of legal professional privilege. The bill also deals with penalties for disclosure and tipping off, because that is one of the dangers in giving anybody access to information. There's also always a risk of the information being used inappropriately. And the fine is a very, very hefty $500,000. And some of us might argue that it is too hefty. And then also, the bill broadens the scope of some of what exists already. So I will say 6 things, Madam President. Some of my colleagues have argued, for example, Senator Obika, Senator Sturge, who I'm happy to see here. I think everybody knows how fond I am of him. And Senator Sturge used the expressions extremely intrusive and extremely draconian. That is exactly what it is. And that is why this bill is being passed with a special majority. It is intrusive and it is draconian, but it is also necessary. And that is the part that he left out. It is not a unique piece of legislation. From time to time, particularly in the realm of criminal law, we are called upon to pass legislation which is inconsistent with the Constitution. And I've made the point many, many times. We are not here to argue constitutionality. We could debate constitutionality. But in the context of the law, we are here to put in place what we believe best protects the citizens of the country. And there's another place where the constitutionality could be challenged for those who wish to do that. So for those who say it is intrusive and draconian and dangerous, I agree with you. And that is why we've taken the approach of requiring a special majority. I want to go to something Senator Obika said, however, in relation to this Constitution and fundamental rights and so on. And he says that, of course, he opens with the now usual cry. The 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th words of his contribution call the election now. Well, when it was called in 2010 and you had 5 years, you did nothing like this. If it's called now and you get back into office, nothing could tell the population that you'll do anything like this. But you say that we're seeking to bring a very dangerous piece of legislation to this House. You know, I've listened to the few speakers on the opposition so far. And they create this sense of fear. There's something to be worried about in this. I'm frightened about this legislation. And I use it very sparingly on you because I know how it hurts. I know there's one thing that hurts you terribly, So I use it very sparingly because I love you. But Rishmi Ramnarayan didn't hurt you. That is what troubles me. You are worried. You are saying that this is a dangerous piece of legislation that is being brought to the Parliament. The Parliament is a place where you bring dangerous pieces of legislation. And this is not brought here capriciously. I've asked you many times to read the legislative agenda. The Attorney General, my colleague and friend Faris Al-Rawi, created history. How many times I'll tell you that? Created history by placing in this Parliament a 5-year legislative agenda. And if you look on the legislative agenda, in the first section, which is red, so it will catch your attention because you love red, you would see short term, 2015 to 2017. And item number 10 is miscellaneous provisions, firearms, interception of communication, FIU, TT, and Exchange Control Bill 2016. We telegraphed to you via a legislative agenda, which is still on the website of the Parliament, our intention to bring legislation to deal with interception of communication. We telegraphed that to you. We did, in fact, debate a bill. We brought the miscellaneous provisions bill and did not have the interception of communication element in it. We had FIU, we had exchange controls. We did not have firearms because we decided to treat with firearms in a separate piece of legislation. And we decided to treat with interception of communication in a separate piece of legislation. So the Miscellaneous Provision Bill 2017 was assented to in May 2018, and it covers those things that we said we would do, except for firearms and interception of communication. And thereafter, we brought by separate legislation firearms amendment legislation. And now we've brought the interception of communication piece into the Parliament. This is not Rishmi, a computer clerk, elevated. The word is czar. If you read the SSA legislation, you would see that the head of that agency develops and implements a counter-narcotics strategy for Trinidad and Tobago in the context of a regional plan to counter narcotics in the region. And you had no fear of doing that. You did it in the dark of the night, in the most capricious manner, in the most ill-informed manner, with absolutely no oversight and no care and concern for the citizens of this country. And you have the gall to come here in this Parliament today and talk about a government that puts on its parliamentary agenda the intention to bring this piece of legislation. And not only brings the piece of legislation, but brings it requiring the support of the two houses. Because you may refuse to support it here, you know. And the votes of the independents may get it through here. The question is if it would pass in the other place. And we have not offered a slim version of the legislation that would require a simple majority. We've placed ourselves under the glare of every legislator in this House and everyone in the other House, making it very clear what is required in the context of what is happening in the prisons. A scanner will not solve the problem. For the last 25 years, complex crime has been fought using technology, and we are way behind. We are way behind. But you know what? This legislation in 1986, the US introduced stored communication legislation, and it hasn't developed much since then. This piece of legislation will put us close to the forefront of what has to be done. And if you're worried about a special advocate, in 1997 was the first time in the English law the concept of special advocate was introduced. 1997. I was 2 years out of law school. This year I celebrate my 25th year in this profession. So we're behind. And this helps us. Not tomorrow, and not when my friends over there claim they're going to win, but tonight. Tonight we decide to put this in the hands of law enforcement agency, the power to listen to the calls. Because Senator Sobel said to us, you are encouraging a cell phone problem in the prison. That is what he said. He said by bringing law to intercept calls, you are encouraging a cell phone problem. So what did you do about it? I have seen searches in the prisons. I have seen the results of searches with thousands of boxes of cigarettes and cartoons of cigarettes and all kinds. What did you put in place to deal? You come and you ask for scanners now. What did you do? What are you asking the population when you cry every time you get a chance to stand up and say, call an election now? What are you asking them to allow you to finish? To bring our next Rishmi where? To bring our next unqualified person as unqualified as you were. To put where? The fight against crime is a fight that is people and legislation. And this is an important piece of legislation. It's just like outside St. Mary's Fete CIC, after the all-inclusive finish. You wouldn't want to hear what is being discussed in our prison van? What else we have? What other ways we have of reaching the information that is required? And when we gather it, what use would we make of it? What is the sense of gathering the information? It is you, the party that the 6 of you represent, you who failed to bring to the Parliament the reports, the annual reports on interception of communication. You failed to bring the reports. And you had one of your, the word that they use in the US politics, it went out my head. You had one of your friends take the Minister of National Security to court and compel him to lay in Parliament all the reports that you failed to lay. And I was shocked as a member of the Parliament and a citizen of the country, as a member of the Cabinet, to see every report say that nothing was done with the interceptions. There were thousands of interceptions. Every report, go back and check the reports, you would see thousands of interceptions. And the report said zero follow-up or zero action or zero use. We have not brought this legislation with the intention that it would be put to use and nothing will come out of it. The intention is that what is gathered through the force of this piece of legislation will be offered as evidence in the court, because we can't do that now. You've talked about interfering with private citizens. Well, I'll tell you this. Nothing in this legislation adds to what a private citizen is already at risk in this country. Nothing in here adds any additional risk. The power of law enforcement to be able to listen to conversations, to be able to access information, to be able to use the devices to know it exists already. It exists already. And nothing in this legislation adds to that. You talked about using it as evidence. So what is the sense? What is the sense of gathering the information if it cannot be used? Or it cannot at least be offered as evidence? What is the sense of it? And then I listened to Senator Sturge as he talked about the word shall, and suggesting that the law will force a judge to accept something as evidence. Well, the judge always has the discretion. And there's a line that he used there that he made it sound as though it does not exist already in the law and has been subject to so much interpretation. In the interest of justice. The expression "in the interest of justice" has been tried and tested, just as balance of probability and all of those things. It's been tried and tested. And it is for the judicial officer to make a determination ultimately. But as Senator Chote has rightly said, if we're going to do this, let us do it by statute in the full glare of the public and with the knowledge that we're not doing it by simple majority, but we're placing it squarely on the shoulders of the legislators in this House and the other place. That is what we have to do. The bill itself, as you know, applies to 5 categories. And the proposed clause 4, the AG, Honorable AG has circulated an amendment, and the amendment intends to insert, after what is now clause 4 of this bill, a new 4A. But the bill intends that the Act applies to criminal proceedings under POCA, the Proceeds of Crime Act, extradition proceedings, Anti-Terrorism Act proceedings, and the most recent one, the civil asset recovery, what we call Explain Your Wealth legislation. And of course, accepts out cases where the trial has already commenced. The definition part of the bill is the part of the bill that is very critical if we are to achieve what we want to achieve. And as I said before, the U.S. finds itself unable to apply its stored communication legislation to some of the modern scenarios that have developed. And to do that, you have to continue. As the technology has changed, you have to keep updating your legislation. So we find ourselves coming here on many occasions to add to the definition or to build the definition, even in the cybercrime bill, which is being considered by a GSC. Every time you feel that you've made progress and you've reached a point, new scenarios, or an expert or somebody gives you advice which tells you, well, it doesn't cover this and it doesn't cover that. So it is vital, but the point I want to make in relation to the definition of communications data and stored data is this. I think Senator Chote used the expression metadata, because there's always a fear or a concern that the granular data, the information that is personal to people, is the information that is being accessed. But the intention of the law is to deal with what I describe as metadata. And it is important, for example, when you look at the definition of device, to know that these things are constantly changing. And we have to understand that we'll keep coming back to the Parliament to deal with situations that we had not envisaged or to deal with changes in the technology. I had referred to the issue of tipping off and I will refer you to the proposed Clause 6, which seeks to amend Section 6 of the Act, and that deals with the disclosure of information which is intercepted and the disclosure that is intentional. And that, in my mind, seeks to strike the balance between accessing, making use of, disclosing information, and on the other hand, disclosing information in a capricious manner or disclosing information in a manner it was not intended when the decision to collect the information was made. The change that is being proposed, again in Clause 6, under 6B2, is a very important change. And that has to do with what I spoke about before, this issue of admissibility. By deleting the current provision which says that the information shall not be accessible as evidence in any criminal proceedings, and in its place substituting the words may subject to Section 17.2b and 17.2c admissible as evidence in any proceedings. I had referred to Clause 7, where I said it strikes the balance, and that is Clause 7 seeking to introduce a new 6A, and 6A1 provides for the Commissioner of Prisons to inform prisoners and members of the staff of the prison that any communication transmitted to or from any device which is in a prison vehicle or a vehicle used to transport prisoners may be intercepted. And that is, as I said before, balanced by what is provided in the proposed 6A2. Notwithstanding any law to the contrary, the communication shall not be subject to legal professional privilege, shall not be, unless it takes place on a designated device or in such places within the prison as may be specified by the minister. In other words, unless the communication takes place on a designated device or in a place that is designated by the minister by order, the communication will not be protected by legal professional privilege. And that is important. It is, as I say, a further whittling down of this legal professional privilege. I know Senator Sobers had spoken about the reference to rendering assistance under the Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters legislation or giving effect to the provisions. I didn't quite gather the point that he was making. I felt that the legislation was doing what it is supposed to do, what it is meant to do, to give effect to the undertakings that we have given in our mutual assistance agreements. I didn't quite grasp the point he was making, but a lot of what was said by my colleagues, I didn't really grasp the point they were making, notwithstanding my best efforts. And towards the end, Madam President, you see the introduction of all the safeguards, because of course not everything that is intercepted could be intercepted without warrant. You have things that are going to be intercepted without warrants, but you also have things that are set out in the bill that are to be intercepted with warrants, and again striking the balance and trying to preserve, notwithstanding the need and the desire to be invasive, to try to preserve some sort of process in which the existing rights are protected. So, Madam President, I am very happy to have been able to be involved in first the drafting of the bill along with the AG and his team, to see the bill make it to the Parliament, having been promised on our legislative agenda in 2015, and to see it reach to the point of this debate where it has enjoyed support from our colleagues on the independent bench. This is important legislation. I said it before, you want us to be hard on crime, but you want us to be soft on the criminals. The prison is not a place for foolishness. A lot of things are happening in the prison. I will never get it out of my memory. The thought of that little boy in Santa Cruz leaving his graduation, a little boy leaving his graduation with his mother, and somebody reaching there to execute her. And notwithstanding the graphic details published in The Guardian about the fact that that hit was called by a prisoner communicating with somebody on the outside, by a prisoner being visited by somebody frequently. I have seen nothing where anybody has dismissed that as something that is untrue. The Guardian carried it in graphic detail, and it became clear to me as a citizen of this country that that is the truth of the matter. That little boy, leaving his graduation with his mom, lost her at the hands of a prisoner who was able to call a hit from the prison. And if this legislation does one thing, it protects some child or some children or some family, because the prisoners, they have people in the prison, even when they get there, they would not change their ways. It's just like even when the police brutalize you outside CIC, you will still go to the other fete and drink up a storm and exceed the limit, and then curse the police for coming outside and brutalizing you so that you could do the right thing. I thank you very much.
Senator Ameen.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I thank you for this opportunity to contribute to this debate on an act to amend the Interception of Communications Act. Madam President, so many things have been discussed, so many different perspectives have been given. In my humble view, Madam President, the members of this House will be called upon to vote based on conscience and based on patriotism. Patriotism is a devotion to and a vigorous support for one's country. It takes courage to stand for what is right, what is fair, and what is good for country and not for individual. It takes courage to stand for truth and justice. And Madam President, it is said that the cancer of authoritarianism gets into the veins and organs of society, and it is not easy to get out. It can begin the collapse of our democracy. It can paralyze the political mechanism and dismantle fundamental human logic. And Madam President, I am afraid that that is what this bill seeks to do: dismantle our democracy and cause authoritarianism to seep in to governance and our society. And we must not allow that. We must stand firm against it. Madam President, this government has absolutely failed in the war against crime. They seek to abdicate their responsibility to the nation by blaming the opposition, and more recently by the Prime Minister asking the people of this country who are victims of crime not to judge his government on their failure to deal with crime. In my humble view, Madam President, if I am permitted to say so, I think this government has sought to mislead the Senate in this debate. The members on the other side wanted to make us believe...
Well, Senator Ameen, actually, that is not something that you should put in the way that you have, so I would ask you to withdraw and...
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, on listening to the members on the other side, I got the impression that the Interception of Communication Bill was about intercepting communication from prison and prison vehicles in order to prevent and to solve crime, and particular gang-related crime and murders, and that the invasion of privacy should not be a concern to those who have nothing to hide. Madam President, the Minister of National Security indicated that, this bill was specifically to deal with communication from prison. And I felt that that was misleading to me as a member of this House. Madam President, we were told that the bill will deal with telephone conversation and other forms of communication from prisoners to people outside of the prison. that it would deal with, that would allow the authorities to intercept communication between attorneys and accused persons, as well as accused persons in prison, as well as accused persons who are not in prison. But this bill also allows the interception of communication between two ordinary citizens, the interception of the communication of holders of public office, the interception of communication of journalists, social activists, and quite frankly, anyone who disagrees with the government could have their communications intercepted. This bill is in fact a bill to allow the authorities to access text messages, phone calls, telephone calls, emails, WhatsApp, Instagram direct messages, Facebook messengers of every single citizen of this country. Madam President, I felt sick to my stomach to hear two members on the other side refer to persons who lost their lives. A reference to a prison officer who was slain on the streets of our capital city, Port of Spain, and reference to a lady who was leaving the graduation of her son with her son, who was a state witness in a matter, in an ongoing matter, who was gunned down in front of her son. And hearing well, I am not aware that the matters surrounding the case has been determined, but I know that it would have been widely reported in the newspaper, but I don't think any one of us here has the authority to indicate that it was actually, what the circumstances were, there are allegations, and the trial is not completed. But Madam President, I listened to the speaker before me and one before that, condemning the heinous act, and I join with them in condemning the criminals who carried out the act, in condemning the criminals who took the life of the prison officer and that mother who was a state witness. Madam President, had the jammers been in use, that prison officer and that state witness could have been alive today. And the government has to take responsibility for the loss of those lives. Madam President, the government has to take responsibility for the loss of control that is leading to increased criminal activities in this country. At present, murder is out of control, robberies and home invasions are on the rise, kidnapping for ransom in Trinidad and Tobago has returned. We were told that the Anti-Gang Act, the Attorney General had indicated that the government or the authorities has the name of every gang leader and that they can take them off the streets once that legislation was passed. Exactly. We, the people of Trinidad and Tobago, are still waiting. And while we wait, we are being terrorized. And every day that this government fails on the job, the people of Trinidad and Tobago are getting more and more desperate for a solution. And that desperation and that fear that is being created in the country is what this government is using to infringe on the rights of citizens. Exactly. Even in the face of the fear that we in this nation face, Madam President, we in this Parliament have a duty to vote to protect all the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Let us not be so desperate that our thinking becomes clouded, that we are willing to sacrifice our rights, to allow our personal, private, and confidential communication of all types to be intercepted, to be accessed, and to be used against us at any time, whether it is now or in the future. Madam President, as much as we say we can balance the request and the permission we will give for that invasion of privacy in this bill based on the need and the violence we see in our society, it is very clear that the mechanisms for checks and balances and the political influence on the interception of communication in our present system leaves much to be desired. The protection of data, the protection of any data that could be intercepted, the protection of the identity of persons, regardless of their walk of life, now hangs in the balance. Madam President, in legal proceedings, where the state is bringing action against a private citizen or an entity, a company, any communication from parties involved in that matter can be intercepted and can serve, even if it is not used as evidence, can serve to inform the state and put the state at an unfair advantage. Madam President, my colleague Sean Sobers spoke about attorney-client privilege, the trouble he as a practicing attorney had with the fact that a designated device, the communication there would be protected, but very often when he goes to see his clients, the designated area is not available and he would be directed to another area that by law will not be protected with his client, attorney-client privilege. So, Honorable Senator, the Honorable Clarence Rambharat, who is an attorney but may not have the practice as Senator Sobers in terms of being in the, dealing with criminals, with clients of that type, may have a different perspective with regards to law and with regards to the practical aspect of the criminal justice system. So, Madam President, that is one area of concern. Another area, Madam President, that we have seen played out is the likelihood of political mischief being created. Madam President, we have had, not now, we have had instances of spying brought to the public. We have had political prosecution as far back as the 1970s, which my brother Taharqa Obika touched on and shared with us. We have had, under previous PNM government, similar allegations. In the last few weeks, in fact, in the media, the government has been accusing the opposition of criminal involvement, insinuating that the opposition was involved in murders in Port of Spain, a fact that has been disputed by the Commissioner of Police, who has set the record straight that no such investigation exists.
Senator Ameen, let me caution you here. I don't think you should go down that path, okay? So I think you should now move on to another aspect of your presentation.
Is there a report, is a public document?
Madam President, I was referring to a newspaper article where the Commissioner was quoted. I just want to say that for the record, a newspaper article where the Commissioner of Police was quoted as saying that the police is not investigating members of the opposition for any involvement in crime. Madam President, national security is serious business. The government has a responsibility to protect citizens. For any government, to use the apparatus of state, whether it is intelligence, whether it is data, whatever information, to target political opponents is reckless and dangerous, and it must never be condoned, regardless of who does it. This country, Madam President, has seen the scandalous accusation of Emailgate, which turned out to be baseless, and now we are seeing a narrative being put forward by the government at a time when we are discussing the Interception of Communication Act. making allegations that opposition members are involved in crime. And that too, Madam President, will prove to be baseless. And I think the population has already dismissed it because they do not trust the government and they have seen their modus operandi. In my case, Madam President, I can tell you it is almost laughable. For the past few weeks, I know the minister had been making some allegations, and earlier in this debate, the Minister of National Security made reference to a UNC deputy political leader who, I don't know, is...
Senator Ameen,
yes.
I'm going to ask you not to deal with this issue in your presentation. I'm going to ask you, I've just asked you before, move on to something else in your presentation, please.
Yes. Madam President, the minister said that in this debate, so I thought I could respond.
Senator Ameen,
because I am a deputy political leader.
Have a seat. Senator Ameen, please have your seat. I am making a ruling here, and I am making a ruling based on, I would ask you, please, to abide by the ruling, okay?
Madam President, Madam President, I just want to state for the record that in spite of allegations made in previous contributions, here, as well as allegations made elsewhere, I personally, I do not know or have I ever had any criminal association or any criminal involvement. For any person, any minister to suggest, state, or insinuate otherwise is to indicate a total fabrication and total untruth.
I mean, I am asking you once again to move on, and I'm not going to ask you again.
President. Madam President, also under attack will be journalism. For those in the business of exposing the truth, that will always offend those who wish to cover it up. Madam President, investigative journalism.
Rise on standing order. 53(1)(b). All of these have been said multiple times already.
Senator Obika, please do not start to go down that road, okay? The Attorney General has invoked a standing order as he's entitled to do, and I will make my ruling, okay? Senator Ameen, please continue.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, my concern with investigative journalism in Trinidad and Tobago and the risk that this Interception of Communication Act will pose. In this country, we have seen over the years the development of investigative journalism as a field. There are certain persons who have developed a reputation as journalists who uncover all kinds of activities in public life, in private life, in government. And in fact, I am sure that some of those persons may have experienced intimidations and threats to their lives. However, I am concerned that access to the conversations of these journalists would not only put them at risk, but also their sources at risk. The content of any communication intercepted can lead to approaches being made to induce them. Money, bribes, maybe government houses or government jobs. Attempts to intimidate, to threaten the lives, the well-being, the livelihood of these persons. Attempts to harass not only the journalists, but the sources and their families. Or, Madam President, you can see an attempt to defame that journalist and to undermine their credibility in the eyes of the nation based on this new access that the authorities will have in this Interception of Communication Act. Whereas before, that privilege that journalists had with their sources would have been protected, it is no longer protected. That, Madam President, to me is very dangerous to our democracy, as freedom of speech and freedom of expression in journalism will be threatened. Madam President, this bill creates an offense. There's a fine for tipping off, where information is obtained by the authorities, by those authorized to intercept the communication, and that I could understand. I agree that any person who is privy to confidential information should face a heavy penalty if they in fact tip off the person who is investigated. But, Madam President, I now want to raise the question, what about if the information is used not to tip off, but if the information is misused or abused in any way, as we are seeing presently unfolding in this country? We must be grateful that as much as we in the opposition and members of the public may disagree with how certain information is being treated with at present, that it allows us an opportunity to reflect. So we could very early see what could go wrong if a person who is privy to information is reckless and irresponsible. That person could be a member of the SSA, it could be the director, it could be a part of a person in the judiciary, it could be a minister of government. But, Madam President, the abuse and misuse of this information should also carry a very heavy penalty. We must not forget, Madam President, that it was the PNM who was exposed for spying via telephone on the leader of opposition, on judges, on members of the opposition, on any person who spoke out against them. I remember there was a female comedian who was a talk show host, and it was revealed that her phone was also tapped. And that is the extent the government at the time went to interfere or to intercept the communication of any person who spoke against them. Where is that leading? Is that leading to dealing with criminal activities, or is that leaning towards political prosecution and taking action against any person who speaks out against this government? We must ask ourselves that, and I don't think it's a hard answer to get. Madam President, I also want to express concern with the clause 15, where they would delete the word criminal and now allow these communications to be used as evidence in any proceedings. Madam President, several of my colleagues before would have expressed concern with that. I want to, for the sake of the citizens, indicate how far-reaching it can be. When there is an industrial dispute, when there is some issue with regards to employment and it goes to court, it goes to the industrial court, that is a procedure, a matter that is not a criminal proceeding, that is not a criminal hearing, that communication that was intercepted, communication that was stored from either party can be used against you, the citizen. If you end up before the court with regards to a property dispute, if there is a constitutional matter, if there is some judicial review matter, if you as a citizen sue the state for negligence or any wrongdoing, if you have cause to sue the state for breach of contract, any of these actions, if it ends up with a legal proceeding, interception, your communication, whether it be by email, text message, phone call, could be used against you. So to tell the population that this bill is about dealing with criminals and reducing crime and dealing with gang violence and communication in prison is misleading. I want to plead with Trinidad and Tobago to not be held to ransom. This government has refused to implement key measures to fight crime. They come and they talk as though they are sympathetic with those who have lost their lives. They condemn those who would have called the hit and those who pulled the trigger. But by refusing to use the jammers in the prison to prevent the communication that gave the direction to end those people's lives, you pull the trigger on those people. You are responsible. Madam President, this...
Senator Ameen, in addition to using somewhat inflammatory language, you are now starting to go back to parts of your presentation that you delivered earlier. So I'd ask you to move on, please.
Madam President, no part of this bill changes the law that makes the possession of a mobile phone, an electronic device, or a camera in prison illegal. The government seems to be indicating from the contributions of several speakers on the other side that instead of preventing these communications with persons in prison, they find it useful to monitor these conversations instead and to use whatever information or intelligence it gathers in the hope of solving cases, cracking criminal rings, and putting more prisoners behind bars. But it is also putting prison officers and others at risk. And the legal minds will have to tell us, and I suspect, Madam President, that we will see it tested. What is the legality of using evidence obtained from an illegal act? If communicating on an electronic device, a cell phone, is illegal, is not permitted, if the possession of that very device is not permitted, and the government wants to allow an illegal act to continue so that they can get evidence, I am concerned about the danger they are exposing all of us to. So my friends in the opposition, on the independent bench and in the public, the members of the government have already predictably all expressed support for the bill. We must be guardians of the rights of our citizens. We must be devoted to and in vigorous support for our country. We must stand for what is right and fair and good for country and not for individual. I am a patriot of Trinidad and Tobago, and I cannot support the erosion of the rights of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, I thank you.
Senator Thompson-Ahye.
Thank you, Madam President, for the opportunity to say just a few words. I've heard it said here that the bill is dangerous. I agree, it is dangerous. But I will say that we live in dangerous times and amongst dangerous people. I heard it was intrusive. It is intrusive. But we are living with desperate situations which require desperate remedies. I was really surprised that there are so many other jurisdictions that have this type of legislation. I shouldn't be, because in this world, which really is a global village, there is so much that is going on that is criminal and that is so common to so many of us. So I looked near and far, and one legislation that I found useful that was not included, because there are very few that were included with the bill essentials. I found the Interception of Communication Act, bill of the same name from Zimbabwe, and I found it was useful for the few things I wanted to say. When I looked at clause, now it's 9 in one bill and it's 8 in the other bill, so perhaps we can term it in the consolidated version 9, the one that deals with the amendment of section 8. And it deals with the circumstances for the grant of the warrant. And I found in the Zimbabwe bill 8 different circumstances, and I would like to commend those circumstances to the Attorney General, many of which are repeated in our particular bill. But one I would like him to look at, and I don't think it is replicated in our bill, is that the application shall contain the following information, one of which is the basis for believing that communication relating to the ground on which the application is made will be obtained through the interception. When you look at the various guidelines, I note that they're rather bare in terms of what you have to state to the court to move the court to make a decision in your favor, so that you can say a number of things, but the basis on which that communication is made, the fact that you make a positive statement, it does not seem to be there. And I see the Attorney General looking through frantically, and he's probably saying, like Shylock, it is not in the bill. But so look at that. And the other thing I saw is that in the process, there was an appeal. Now, you may say there's always a right of appeal in law, but this is actually written into the legislation. Appeal for some administrative tribunal, maybe in the nature of a judicial review, and it's a 1 month. If you agree by the warrant that you can appeal to the court within 1 month of being notified or becoming aware of it, as the case may be. So at what stage, you can appeal. Perhaps the Attorney General could look at that and see if something could be put in there. Now, one provision that occurs again and again is the review of the exercise of the power. And it's almost identical in the legislation that we have generally, the review. But in this case, in the Zimbabwe legislation, in our legislation, the review is done by Parliament. And in the Zimbabwe legislation, the review is done by the Attorney General. So the decision, the actions and so on, is by the minister who is in charge of national security. I know there might be a bit of uneasiness if you have a provision to say, well, look, before we bring it to the Parliament, perhaps what can happen is that the Attorney General can actually look at the legislation and at the end of the calendar year and see whether the exercise of the powers was done in a proper way, and what recommendations can be made, and the minister shall comply with those recommendations. So those are the few things that I saw that may improve the legislation. I know one doesn't like to go back to the drawing board, but it may be useful to have another look at it and see how we can improve it so that we can make people a little happier. Nobody's going to be happy with this legislation, very few people, but unless you are on the, I don't want to say the right side of the law, but we don't like to see people's rights being whittled away. But one recognizes, I hadn't finished. Then you would understand that there are times when it is necessary. So now you can stand, now you can hit the table. Sometimes it is necessary to whittle down one's rights in the interest of the society and the interest of good governance. Thank you, Madam President.
Senator Mark.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the bill that is before us serves to erode, severely erode, the citizens' fundamental human rights and freedoms, and threatens in its current incarnation to completely and fundamentally remove privacy interests. Now, this is being advanced, Madam President, purportedly on the ground of fighting crime and addressing national security. Maybe, Madam President, it is also, or it has been said, I should say, that the road to hell is sometimes paved with good intentions. Madam President, if this bill were ever to become law, it would eviscerate privacy, rights, and it would humiliate the individual. And this is a typical technique that has been used by the Nazis in Germany under Adolf Hitler. It is what can lead to what I would like to describe, Madam President, as a move towards a totalitarian state. Madam President, what is at stake in this piece of legislation is what I would like to describe as the mass or bulk interception of private information and communication. That is what is at stake in TNT. And I am so happy that we have in Trinidad and Tobago today the United National Congress. It is only the United National Congress that can stop this government in its tracks. You may get your support here tonight, but I want to tell you tonight, this evening, the United National Congress, Madam President, will never undermine and agree to legislation that will establish what I would like to describe as a Gestapo Nazi political arrangement in Trinidad and Tobago. We will never ever do that. We will die first than to have that ever established. So I want, Madam President, to invite you to understand a lot of points have been made, Madam President, and I will demonstrate in my contribution. Absolutely no safeguards have been established in the legislation. Madam President, may I tell you where this government extracted and got inspiration for most of the provisions that we have in this piece of legislation? Madam President, it came from the Investigatory Powers Act of the United Kingdom of 2016. And before that, it came from something called the Regulation of Investigatory Power of 2000. And the parent to this is called the Interception of Communications Act of the United Kingdom. But Madam President, I will demonstrate a little later on in my contribution the amount of safeguards and oversight mechanisms that are established in these pieces of legislation to protect the rights and freedoms of the people of the United Kingdom against arbitrariness and against abuse of power by anyone within that society, and particularly officials. So, Madam President, the bill in its current form is absolutely far-reaching, sweeping, dangerous, intrusive, draconian, and invasive, Madam President. And Madam President, I will invite you to join with me to look at our Constitution, the sacred document that governs Trinidad and Tobago as a nation. Madam President, I will demonstrate in the various clauses of this bill where this piece of legislation violates the Section 4A, that is the enjoyment of property of the individual. It violates Section 4B, equality and protection before the law. It violates the right of the individual to respect for his private and family life, Madam President. It violates the freedom of thought and expression, and it violates the freedom of the press. Madam President, not only does it stop there in its violation, Madam President, what it does as well, it actually deprives a person under Section 5(2)(e) to a fair hearing in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice in our country. Madam President, it also deprives a person or denies a person to a fair and public hearing by an independent and impartial tribunal. Madam President, it doesn't stop there. The inequality, or I should say, Madam President, the equality of the arms of the prosecution and the defense have been breached. So what we have in the legislation today, Madam President, is the prosecution being given an unequal status as it relates to the adversarial system that we have in the justice arrangement in TNT. Madam President, this legislation, I will show you and I will demonstrate how it violates the separation of powers, where we are legislating, I should say, and directing the judiciary to do what we know it ought not to be asked to do. And as I said, Madam President, absolutely no safeguard. Madam President, we have before us this evening a piece of legislation that, when you examine it very carefully, Madam President, you will see where initially, before the amendments arrive here today, new sets of amendments, there was no role outlined for the magistrate. There was no role outlined for the constable. There was no role outlined for the commissioner of police. There was no role outlined for the attorney at law defending his client. But in today's amendment, these elements have now been introduced, Madam President. What the government is seeking to do, Madam President, is to engage in what I would like to describe as mass interception of communication in Trinidad and Tobago. Madam President, that is only associated, as you know, with states and governments that has no respect for fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms. And you have a government in its dying moments, Madam President. The government in its dying moments come to Parliament so that we can give them a lifeline. You want us in the opposition to support legislation that will compromise the rights and freedoms of every citizen of our country, and to allow any police constable to interfere and intercept and invade my private spaces, to listen to every conversation I am having on my telephone, or snatch my messages that I'm sending via email without a warrant, without any judicial oversight. Mr. Attorney General, I want to tell you tonight and this evening, this bill is, Madam President, Mr. Vice President, I beg your pardon. This bill, Mr. Vice President, is not only deceptive and insidious. This bill, Mr. Vice President, is deliberately calculated to undermine the fabric of our democracy. That is the intention of this government.
Rise on Standing Order 53-1B.
Senator Mark, just in terms of the descriptive language, which is what we've heard at the beginning of your contribution, and it's now more than 10 minutes in. Just rein that in and continue along.
Yes, Mr. Vice President, I want to indicate to you and to this honorable House that when we are dealing with legislation that is designed to handcuff, kidnap, incarcerate the citizens of this country, we will not support it. We will not give life to this government. Mr. Vice President, let me invite you to understand what we are saying here this evening. I want you to go to the definition section of the legislation. to understand the danger that this government poses. The PNM in its present manifestation, Mr. Vice President, poses a clear and present danger to our democracy in this country. They pose a danger. Mr. Vice President, hear what this government is proposing in legislation. Hear how they describe stored communication in the definition section. It means any communication or communications data which has been, Mr. Vice President, which has been transmitted. Not to be transmitted, you know, Mr. Vice President, which has been transmitted. So what this government is saying, Mr. Vice President, communication data which has been transmitted by a telecommunication network and is stored on any facility capable of retaining such communication or communications data.
I rise on standing order 53-1B. This is tedious repetition. This was the full submission of Senator Sturge.
Senators, by now, in relation to bills that are engaging the attention of the chamber, would understand that the lower down in the order you are to speak, as much as you're entitled to, does become increasingly difficult as you are making a contribution and fall prey to repeating some of the comments that have gone before. Senator Mark, I would rule that that is what is occurring here. And if you have anything new to bring to the argument at this point in time, I do invite you to do so. Senator Mark.
I'm not repeating, sir.
So we know the procedure.
Okay.
Continue.
Yeah. So, Mr. Vice President, what the government is seeking to do, Mr. Vice President, is to access retroactively all your private information and communication in order for them to build a case. A case, Mr. Vice President, against your good self or against someone else. And what we are saying, Mr. Vice President, a legislation ought never to be designed to be retroactive in nature. Because as you know, an individual, when charged, is not guilty. It is only when he goes to trial and evidence is proffered and a decision is arrived at, then the person can be found by a jury or his peers to be guilty or not guilty. And Mr. Vice President, when someone is charged, you charge them on the basis of evidence. You cannot charge somebody without evidence. But what the legislation is saying, Mr. Vice President, is once you are charged and the evidence at the level of the trial has not begun, Mr. Vice President, then interception of your communication can now commence.
Mr. Vice President, I rise on standing order 53-1B. Senator Sturge gave us all of that. He called it insidious. This is really a complete rehash of what we've heard already. Most respectfully for your consideration.
Again, Senator Mark, I'm advising the commentary in relation to the retroactivity to which you are speaking was indeed and in fact heard before. Therefore, the standing order raised in relation to tedious repetition does hold. So I'm going to ask you once again, as you're going forward, please bring forward any points you may have that are new to the debate at this juncture. Continue.
Mr. Vice President, I know the Attorney General is anxious to wind up this debate, So hence his interest in interrupting my contribution. Mr. Vice President, now that you have given me an opportunity to raise some additional points, I want to go to the contribution made by Senator Clarence Rambharat. He said, Mr. Vice President, that on the agenda, legislative agenda of the government, the Interception of Communications Bill was stated for the session or the period 2015 to 2017. And therefore, it has now arrived. And the Honorable Senator said he was very happy to be associated with this piece of legislation he had drafted. Mr. Vice President, I got in my mailbox a piece of legislation called the Interception of Communications Amendment Bill 2018. This is not the bill that is before you, sir. This was the bill that was sent out in 2018. And I looked at this bill carefully, Mr. Vice President, that I got in my mailbox. And nowhere in that bill was any mention made of any prisoners or intervening from a telecommunication perspective or from an interceptive perspective, prisoners' conversation, whether they're in prison or they're out of prison. Mr. Vice President, nowhere in this 2018 legislation that was sent out by the Office of the Attorney General did the Attorney General indicate in this legislation that he was going to introduce civil proceedings as it relates to interception, evidence, admission at the level of matters of a civil nature or any other proceedings. That was in 2018, Mr. Vice President.
Standing order 46-1. Whatever that senator is referring to, the honourable senator, is not before this House, nor can any of us speak to it. Therefore, it is directly in part of relevance, and I therefore challenge on the ground of relevance.
Okay, Senator Mark. So, you have brought up the fact that you received a bill prior, and I assume there is some connection to what is before us now. What I'm going to ask you to do is to make that connection. If you're doing so now, you don't need to explain anything that was there before, because we're not debating the 2018 bill.
I am not debating the bill, sir.
Go ahead.
Mr. Vice President, what I'm simply saying is that this bill...
Mr. Vice President, in accordance with Standing Order 14.5, I beg to move that the Senate continue to sit until the completion of the business at hand, inclusive of the matters on the adjournment.
Honourable Senators, the question is that the Senate continue to sit until the completion of the business at hand, inclusive of the matters on the adjournment. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. Senate will continue to sit until the completion of the business at hand, inclusive of the matters on the adjournment. Senator Mark?
Yeah. I am asking the Attorney General if he's aware of this 2018 bill. I know not now. You'll get it when I sit. So, Mr. Vice President, I'm asking where the changes came from. Who did he consult to bring all these changes? Because in the 2018 bill, he didn't have these things. The prisoners were not there, Mr. Vice President. So where did this come from? Only criminal proceedings were included. Civil were not there. Where did it come from? The Attorney General has to answer that. Mr. Vice President, when we come to the whole question of the rights of the citizens, we have, Mr. Vice President, in the legislation that is before us, it is the Interception of Communications Bill, which is amending the Parent Act. And Mr. Vice President, we are being told that the bill is designed to fight crime, and to deal with serious crime, and to deal with complex crime. Mr. Vice President, I have in my possession the 2017 annual report of the Interception of Communications Act, which was laid today in this Honorable House. And Mr. Vice President, we are seeing, Mr. Vice President, where the evidence before us is showing the opposite. We are seeing where the government is trying to present a fig leaf to cover something in order to achieve a particular objective. So here it is, Mr. Vice President, we have before us Table B on page 12, headed Director of Strategic Services, and we are seeing, Mr. Vice President, where 163 warrants were issued to the Director of Strategic Services Agency. And Mr. Vice President, out of 163 warrants that were issued, you know how many mobile cellular calls they were able to listen to with these 163 warrants? 972,232. Almost 1 million intercepts. This is in 2017, you know. So almost 1 million telephone, mobile conversation were intercepted with 163 warrants. We don't know how many individuals are involved because that is not given here. One warrant might have 10 individuals. We don't know. So, in addition, Mr. Vice President, the Commissioner of Police requested and got the SSA to intercept 551,466 mobile cellular conversation in Trinidad and Tobago. That was in 2017, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, in terms of data, your email, they are able to extract 348,602 data they pulled from your system in 2017. And for the COP, that is the Commissioner of Police, 35,080. Mr. Vice President, when you add up, it is almost 1.4 million interception in 2017. And this is before this bill arrived here. So what I'm saying to you, Mr. Vice President, when you look at, for instance, the number of persons arrested whose identity became known to the authorized officer, 5. When you look at the number of criminal proceedings commenced by the state in which private communications obtained by interception under a warrant were adduced, 0. So, Mr. Vice President, the question that we have to ask is whether we look at 2016 or we look at 2017, we are seeing where the government is intervening through an agency called the SSS, whose director is politically appointed, not independent. He's not independent, he's appointed by the Minister of national security. And that is why, Mr. Vice President, we as a nation have to be concerned. When you put so much power into the hands of these people, Mr. Vice President, what is going to happen to the rights and freedoms of our citizens? Mr. Vice President, there are so many cases internationally that deals with invasion, intrusion, and abuse by overzealous officials. And that is why in places like the United Kingdom, there have been established a lot of safeguards in order to protect the rights and freedoms of the citizens from abuse, Mr. Vice President. They want us to give them a blank check, Mr. Vice President, without any safeguards. Mr. Vice President, under the parent legislation, warranted, a judge. Unwarranted, intelligence.
So, Senator Mark, at this point in your contribution, that exact statement has been made before. The argument in relation to warranted and unwarranted, I'm just, Senator Mark, we all have been here all day, and we all have heard the contributions that have gone before. We have heard certain words and statements being made repeatedly along the lines of what you're saying now. At this juncture and at this hour, what I'm looking for is new arguments.
To your attention, it is said that in a democracy, the government will always have its way, but the opposition must have its say. That's what democracy means. But anyway, I'll be guided by your statement, sir. Mr. Vice President, let me go to what no one has spoken about. And I hope that I get my freedom to do what I have to do. Mr. Vice President, I go to the amendments. And I want to ask the Attorney General of this country, page 9 of the amendments I have before me. It reads, the Indictable Offences Preliminary Inquiry Act is amended by inserting after Section 5 the following. And it is stated what is proposed, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I thought in Act number 20 of 2011, which has been assented to and which has been partially proclaimed, I thought I read something called an Act to repeal and replace the Indictable Offences Preliminary Inquiry Act, Chapter 1201. So I want to know why the Attorney General, because under 33(1) of this Act, 20 of 2011, a decision in writing to repeal that Act is outlined. So why, if the intention is to repeal the law, the Attorney General has come to this Parliament to repeal the law, not to repeal it, to amend it? I would like the Attorney General to explain to us, Mr. Vice President, because I have Act number 20 of 2011, which says we are repealing, and we have repealed this act called the Indictable Offences Preliminary Inquiry Act. But here in the legislation, we are being told in these amendments, this act has now been given new life. Something that is dead, that we have repealed, is now given new life. So I want to know, Mr. Vice President, if the Attorney General could explain this magic for us this evening. We want answers. Mr. Vice President, we also would like to know, why is the Minister, and I guess Minister of National Security, is is being given the power, in accordance to the amendment here on page 10, to direct such disclosure to a foreign government or agency of such government where there exists between the state and such foreign government an agreement for the mutual exchange of that kind of information, and the minister considers it in the public interest that such disclosure be made. Mr. Vice President, why is the minister inserted in this legislation? That's the first thing, Mr. Vice President. Yeah, why is he inserted in this legislation? And the second thing I am asking, Mr. Vice President, when you talk about mutual agreements, it could be criminal or it could be of a tax nature. In this legislation that we are amending or is proposing to amend, Mr. Vice President, there's no mention of criminal. So is it tax? And why is the minister involved in this? Mr. Vice President, I see that even the Commissioner of Police has escaped. The Commissioner of Police is now under surveillance by the government of this country. And it's the first time I've seen in legislation where the Commissioner of Police is being told, don't do this, don't do that, and if you do it, you $300,000 or 5 years in jail. Mr. Vice President, where is this thing coming from? So in other words, Mr. Vice President, the system that is being established here under this dictatorial regime called the PNM under the Rowley, Dr. Rowley administration, you know what is being established here? Not even you, Mr. Vice President, shall escape. None of them shall escape. Because if the Commissioner of Police, who is responsible for law and order, is now under the surveillance of the PNM, Mr. Vice President, can you imagine? It is right here, Mr. Vice President. I don't have to spend too much time on it. What this is saying, Mr. Vice President, is that a constable shall not disclose any communication data or stored communication obtained pursuant to this section except to the commissioner. Fine, no problem. But they go on to say, Mr. Vice President, for purposes, the Commissioner of Police shall not disclose any communications data or stored communication obtained pursuant to this section except in connection with his duties. But that is obvious. Why are you putting into legislation a provision to tell the Commissioner of Police that if he does this, he is going to end up in jail for 5 years or 300,000 or both? Mr. Vice President, I'm accusing the government of Trinidad and Tobago of establishing a mass surveillance McCohen mechanism to spy on every citizen in this country, including the Commissioner of Police. That is what I'm accusing the government of this evening, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, I know that my time is rushing on, but I want to tell you, as I have a few seconds again to wind up, I remember a very famous song in my youthful days, Born to Shine. And you know, Mr. Vice President, when I listen to that song and I look at the reality of our country at times, I come to the conclusion that there are people who seem not born to shine, but they're born to thief. Some of them born to lie.
It fall in your garden.
And some of them born to deceive. Some of them. But as Sam Cooke said in his famous song of '63, Mr. Vice President, if you remember that, I guess you weren't born yet. Mr. Vice President, I was. And I could tell you Sam Cooke gave us a famous song, and I keep playing it at times. A change is going to come. A change is going to come. And I want the Attorney General to understand that. Because the law that you pass today, or you seek to pass today, will come to haunt you. Mr. Vice President, I want to tell you, if the United National Congress was on that side, and they were on this side, and we had introduced this piece of legislation, Section 34 would have been a joke in terms of how they would have mobilized the country against the UNC. But you come in 2020 with this piece of draconian legislation, Mr. Vice President, and want us to support it, Mr. Vice President? Mr. Vice President, I want to tell you, in the dying days of this government, they will not get any support. In fact, I want to serve notice on you all of you all. We will not cooperate with you any longer.
Senator, your time is up.
We will isolate you.
Senator, your time. Attorney General.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, I thank you for this opportunity.
Okay, could we allow the Attorney General to begin his wrap-up? Attorney General, continue, please.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Vice President, today was a day of interesting position. We've been 2 days at this legislation over the course of several weeks. We started our journey on the consideration of this law on Tuesday, the 11th of February, 2020. We are now Tuesday, the 3rd of March, 2020. Indeed, we saw significant consideration by members of the independent bench. I wish to thank them wholeheartedly for the contributions made. I think that there were some fulminations that bring us somewhat closer to, first of all, identifying issues which need to be ventilated somewhat more so that we can satisfy the concerns that honorable members have raised. I think that we have also had a consideration of certain amendments that we ought to take, not necessarily in this law, but also in other laws. For instance, the Telecommunications Authority legislation, and certainly in subsidiary legislation, including rules of the Supreme Court. That somewhat fits into the first point that I made of the need to ventilate some of the concerns. Certainly, independent senators raised a number of questions which have to be answered. On the opposition bench, I think that Senator Marks' contribution pretty much encapsulated the concerns of the opposition. They, put quite simply, are an allegation that this law is unconstitutional, an allegation that this law targets the media and other persons in Trinidad and Tobago in a dangerous and draconian way, an allegation that this law is not for the peace, order, and good governance of Trinidad and Tobago. Indeed, we saw the return of Senator Wayne Sturge as fundamentally ill-prepared today as he has been in the past on certain of the laws that he came to contribute on. But I don't mean that in any way other than...
This is offensive. I mean,
Okay, Senator Baker. Continue, Attorney General.
It was certainly very offensive to listen to a contribution from a very ill-prepared senator, but I'll get to that in terms of the response given by Senator Sturge.
President, the Attorney General has repeated the claim. He is out of place in that regard.
Senator Baker, can I bring this House to order? So you're raising the standing order again, and I'm again allowing the Attorney General to continue. Continue, Attorney General.
So, permit me, Mr. Vice President, to go through some of the concerns raised. Perhaps, if you'd permit me to address it in somewhat the order that was given by honorable members in contribution over the 2 days. But let me begin by, first of all, stating what this law is and what this law is not intended to be. So let's start with what this law is. Mr. Vice President, for the record, interception of communication by the state, the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, in its executive form via the SSA, has been a feature of this country's factual matrix since the early 90s. It was Prime Minister Bastio Pandey and Attorney General Ramesh Lawrence Maharaj that purchased the first Intercept suites for the SSE. In fact, Mr. Vice President, the history of this country will demonstrate that the interceptions by the UNC, under the SSA managed by the UNC, that involved a standoff between Prime Minister Bastio Pandey and Attorney General Ramesh Lawrence Maharaj. And that cross-interception that was going on between a UNC Attorney General and a UNC Prime Minister was all over the circumstance of the Piarco Airport inquiry. So significant was the position that Mrs. Prasad Bisesa was made Attorney General for a month.
Please, I want to rise in standing order 46.1. This is totally irrelevant to the matter that we are debating today.
Continue, Attorney General.
And in watching the allegation come from Senator Sobers on the first day that the PNM is to be watched in a particular way, and Senator Saddam Hussein raised it, made an allegation that the history of this country, and I want to address this directly, Senator Hussein's submission was that a PNM government was engaged in spying. And the Honorable Senator referred to the Hansard debates in December 2010, where an allegation was made that, and it was repeated today again by the opposition members, supposedly a president was intercepted, politicians were intercepted, etc. I want to put on record that interception of communication by the executive, the SSA, was something which started under a UNC administration. I can tell you as Attorney General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago that the officer in charge of the SSA that delivered files to Mrs. Prasad Bisesa's home in December 2010 has certified that what has been said by Prime Minister Kamla Prasad Bisesa, the member for Siparia, in December 2010 is untrue. And I'm putting that on the record of this Parliament.
Mr. Vice President,
Mr. Vice President.
The Attorney General is out of order. How can you say?
Mr. Vice President, I am not.
He must apologize.
Mr. Vice President.
Mr. Vice President.
Members, I am on my legs. This chamber will fall to silence now. This method that has been adopted in terms of raising standing orders, where several members are raising standing orders and shouting across the floor at each other, is not the way it's done. The standing orders raised in relation to what the Attorney General is saying does not apply. Continue, Attorney General.
Mr. Vice President.
Senator Obika. Senator Obika. Okay, so I'm going to suspend because it's obvious that my rulings are not being taken seriously. Therefore, I will suspend the sitting for 10 minutes. We'll return at 8:20.